Peace. It's around the corner.
I feel like I'm the same height as everybody when we're virtual, and now I'm realizing how short I am. And I was like, I'm gonna have to stand on the sides.
It is funny, like to see people from the bottom down.
Really high up.
I know, and I feel like this chair is leaving me way far back.
Oh,
We'll
see,
find
that's a
out.
good thing. That's a good thing.
I couldn't find where to hide my lunch. Stare at it and be hungry.
That's what I was like, I can't look at that food. My belly growls. It's your weather.
Okay.
Her like currency.
Okay. Because it's right?
Yeah, they say it in the South. There's a few different ways. My husband's family's from Ohio, so we're her.
Okay. I just want to make sure I say it appropriately. And the rest of you, I might just do it.
Right? Or like Bahama is not Bahama, North Carolina. It is Bahama.
On Ponce de Leon Avenue.
All right, we will go ahead and get started.
Me too.
Welcome to day 2 of Research Week. So good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us, both in person and virtually. We're going to be talking today about the new National Institutes of Health Data Management and Sharing Policy, which becomes effective in January. This session is being recorded, so watch what you say. No. The recording and slides will be made available on the Research Education and Training website shortly following the event. So to kick things off, I am Abby Guillory. I'm the Director of the Research Education and Training team. I'll be your moderator today. So I'm happy to introduce our NC State panelists who will share their knowledge on the topic about upcoming changes and the impact on our NC State research community. So we have Marissa Clarkson, Director of Sponsored Programs. We have Susan Ivey at the far end of the table, Director of Research Facilitation Services, NC State Libraries. We have Megan Kerr, Director of Research Administration in the College of Sciences. And we have Dr. Heather Patasol, Associate Dean for Research, also in the College of Sciences. And Dr. Molly Puente, Assistant Director for Health, Life Sciences, and Agriculture in the Proposal Development Unit. So thank you for serving on our panel today, everyone. We're going to begin this discussion with a brief overview of the new policy. We're going to follow up with some panel comments, and then we're going to address both pre-submitted and questions submitted during our event from both our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience. So we do have microphones that we will pass around whenever it's time for questions. So for our in-person audience, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or speak. And then for our virtual audience, we also have, we'll put up a URL and a code where you'll be able to enter in any of your questions and they'll pop up on my screen. So I will hand this over to Marissa for a brief presentation on the basics of the new policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today, and hopefully we will be providing information. Let's come over here. Hopefully we'll be. Yes, maybe this is better. Okay. Hopefully we'll be providing some good basic information about this new policy, acknowledging that we still have a lot of investigating and kind of putting it into action to do before the implementation date. Okay. Cool. All right. So this is the basic information. The new NIH data management and sharing policy will be effective for applications submitted on or after January 25th, 2023. It will be implemented through the new set of forms, Forms H, to be incorporated into the application guides. NIH is still coming out with guidance that will, be updated in the application guides as it's determined. And then the reason, the purpose behind this new data management and sharing policy is to make the results of research more readily available and to create a consistent minimum requirement for data management and sharing. So under this new data management policy, NIH expects that investigators and institutions will plan and budget for the managing and sharing of data, submit a data management and sharing plan for review when applying for funding, and that the researchers will and the institute will comply with the approved data management plan through the life of the project. One thing to note is that because this policy goes into effect for applications due on or after January 25th of 2023, we probably won't feel the actual expenditure impacts until fiscal year '24. Okay, so what does the new plan apply to? The new policy apply to? It applies to all NIH research funded or conducted in whole or in part by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. That includes all NIH-supported research regardless of funding level, including grants, contracts, research projects, and other applicable funding agreements. What it doesn't apply to is research and other activities that do not generate scientific data, including research training, fellowships, infrastructure development, and non-research activities. Okay, so you're probably wondering, what is the definition of scientific data? So per NIH, scientific data includes any data needed to validate, replicate research findings. What it doesn't include is laboratory notebooks, preliminary analyses, completed case report forms, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, peer reviews, communications with colleagues, or physical objects such as laboratory specimens. One thing I want to point out is that research data, or scientific data, is any data needed to validate and replicate research findings regardless of whether it results in a publication. All right, so some differences when we are comparing the 2003 data sharing policy that we're all familiar with NIH and the new policy coming out in 2023. So the 2003 data sharing policy applied to the sharing of final research data. It was only required for a data management plan was only required for projects with 500,000 or more direct costs in any year of the proposed periods or as applicable by solicitations. And it focused mostly on the sharing of data. So previously, if we submitted a data management plan because of the $500,000 or more in direct costs in any year or the solicitation specific requirement, and we weren't complying with the terms of our plan, NIH could make the data sharing plan a term and condition of the award, but it was not automatically a term and condition of the award. So flipping to the 2023, the new data management and sharing policy, it applies to all research funded or conducted in whole or in part by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. It's focused on not just sharing, but managing and sharing data, with an emphasis on sharing routinely even before research is completed or accepted for publication, or if the research is never published. Additionally, the data management and sharing policy is a binding document that must be approved by NIH before an award is issued, and any changes to the plan must be reviewed and approved by NIH. NIH has also outlined some non-compliance enforcement actions in the case that we don't comply with the data management and sharing plan submitted. They could result in additional terms and conditions of the award, termination of the award, or affect future funding decisions. Okay, so the actual implementation. It will, like I mentioned before, be rolled out with the Forms H, and essentially we will no longer, you will no longer upload it to the resource sharing plans field. There will now be a new field on the PHS 398 research plan or PHS 398 career development award supplemental form for your data management sharing plan and genomic sharing plan, data plan, if you have that as well. Additionally, you'll be able to request costs to cover the expenses that are reasonable and allowable, and I'll touch on some of those in a minute. So you would include that in either in the budget form, section F, under other direct costs, or and include that in the budget justification document, or if it's a modular budget, you would include it in your narrative justification. And I will just actually, before I go to the next slide, touch on some of the costs that NIH has already said they would consider reasonable allowable costs that could be included on budget requests. So that could be curating data, costs associated with developing supporting documentation or formatting data according to accepted community standards, costs associated with de-identifying data, preparing metadata, local data management, and preserving data through repositories. So I just want to give you a preview of what we anticipate this plan will look like based on the template that's been provided by NIH. Each element of the data management plan is spelled out for what they expect to be included within each element, and this is just a draft preview, but we know that NIH is planning on providing a fillable form or an editable version of this. Okay, so if you have human subjects in your NIH-funded research, we really would like to encourage you and empower you to contact the IRB office at grant application stage for guidance on how to address sharing human subjects data, including special considerations. One that NIH has already come out with a supplement on is sharing American Indian and Alaskan Native participant data. So we just want to be very proactive about when we are sharing human subjects data, making sure that all considerations are taken to account. So if you contact IRB office at proposal stage, they can help you with other human subjects questions in the application. And if your research contains human subjects research, when you submit the IRB protocol for review, when you submit the IRB protocol for review and approval, and it includes red or purple data, so sensitive data, the PI will have to submit an additional data access and security plan that addresses the DMP that was submitted at proposal stage, as well as the approved DMSP, so that we make sure that we have concurrence through all three documents. Okay, so another aspect of the data management and sharing policy is NIH is recognizing that there are some limitations to sharing data that could be incorporated in your research. Examples of this are what we just discussed with red and purple data for IRB, or for possible contractual obligations such as data limitations outlined in a data use agreement or an NDA, or controls on scientific data that require prior approval before releasing them. So in the plan, there is an element of the plan that prompts the researcher to discuss data limitations. And so that would be a place where you would want to outline any kind of limitations on sharing the data freely. Okay, so a big difference, or a big focus on this policy is compliance with approved plans. So the way that NIH anticipates checking compliance is through submission of the RPPR report. And I want to reiterate that the Data Management and Sharing Plan is a binding document, and all deviations from the original plan must be approved by NIH. So we would encourage you not to wait until the end of the award to notify NIH of any changes. So it's a lot of information, and I do want to acknowledge that while NIH is still updating guidance, and we are participating in workshops and talks throughout the research community, that it's likely that we'll have additional information to include to the community, or to distribute to the community. But at this time, we recognize that we have areas that we still need to, grow and define before implementation. So some of these include the clarity of our data use agreement, or some of you may call them DSAs or DTAs, data sharing or data transfer agreements, and material transfer agreement processes, for that reason that if there is data that can't be shared broadly, we need to make sure that we're accounting for that. We want to clarify the accepted practice of consulting IRB at proposal stage. Distinguishing roles and responsibilities. So from application time until publication, there will be different steps along the way, and we want to be able to better define that workflow and the resources available at NC State. We want to define the appropriate opportunities to utilize library services, and then provide additional budgeting guidance. And so some ways that we're working on operationalizing these areas of growth are creating a new checklist specifically for this data management and sharing policy, developing a web page with links out to various resources in the community, additional research administration training on the actual process of data management and sharing, again, from application until publication, and additional time for Q&A with the researcher community, because I'm sure as we find out more information about this, it's only natural we're all going to have more questions as well. So I believe that's it. We have some additional resources, and I'm sure the slides will be made available. All right, thank you.
One more. All right. We're live and in person. We can applaud. This is good. Thank you, Marissa. Good. Our last slide displays the information that you need to submit questions via Mentimeter. So you simply need to go to www.menti.com, enter in the code. You can do it both from your computer browser as well as your handy dandy mobile phone. So for our virtual viewers as well as our in-person, if you don't want to talk on a microphone because it's so fun, it's okay, you can submit via Menti. All right? So our working group, put together this great group of individuals to represent NC State on this panel because they represent different areas and different expertise. And so the first question that I'm going to pose, I'm going to give them each a chance to give a little bit of information about how, and share their thoughts on how this change, this policy change will impact their own areas, their own research, and also how they see it impacting the research community here at NC State. So Marissa, I'm gonna put you back on the microphone. Would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I see this as being an extension of the data management, the data sharing policy that NIH currently has for these awards over $500,000. I do think that this policy outlines additional requirements that will take some time to wrap our arms around being able to manage that compliance. And it's such a decentralized structure, such as NC State. But the more guidance that comes out about this, the more confident I am that with this group here, we'll be able to provide some clarity.
That's great. Molly?
Hi, everybody. My name is Molly Puente, and I'm with the Proposal Development Unit. So for those of you who aren't aware of what we do, we work with teams who are getting proposals ready. So I'm really thinking about the pre-award stage, and the two things that are really kind of hitting home for me are both timeline-driven. So one is the timeline for getting proposals ready and thinking about writing your research strategy early enough, or at least outlining it so you know what data you're collecting, because there's going to basically need a lot more research in terms of what are good repositories for the kinds of data that you're collecting, what are the costs associated with those specific repositories, and doing a little bit of research in terms of what your specific institute that you're looking at applying to thinks is the best repository. Because some of the institutes already have systems in place that they're hoping that you go for, whereas others kind of have more of an agnostic approach. So it's going to take a little bit more research on the front end of things. So, starting to get some of those informations well before you're ready to submit is going to be important. So preparation time is something that in the PDU we're taking a serious look at. The other timeline issue is one of the points that Marissa brought up in terms of when the data needs to be shared, and it's before the project period's over. And I think a lot of times teams plan to write their publications after their project, that time kind of runs out. I think this is going to change the way we think about how we're budgeting time. you're kind of deciding between a 4-year or a 5-year R01, there may be more incentive to go for the 5 years and build in that extra time. But if you're going to do that, you have to be very explicit about who is going to be working on the data sharing during that time. And I think there's also a lot of interest in thinking about interim milestone steps. So if you're going to think about writing publications during your proposal, whose effort is going to need to increase in order to do the data sharing and data curation ahead of time, and how can we build that in earlier into the process so that you don't get into the final year of your proposal and wind into trouble. So timelines are really at the forefront of my mind, both in terms of preparation and in terms of actually what's going into your proposal.
That's great. Heather?
Yeah, so I'm Heather Patasol. I'm both an NIH-funded researcher and the Associate Dean for Research, so I'll put my researcher hat on first. I'm submitting a grant today to avoid this policy, or at least put it off, right? But in talking to NIH officials, what they're really worried about is clinical trial data that never shows up and negative results because they just disappear into a black hole. So I'm thinking about how I'm going to curate and store all of that data, because it's maybe not necessarily stuff that's going to go into a publication. And as I've familiarized myself with these different repositories and thinking about timeline, is collecting the data in a way that it's easy to put it in a repository. Otherwise, you have to reformat everything to try and figure out how you're going to upload it to Geo or wherever you're going to put it. So I've had the benefit of working on some good laboratory practices type of studies and other types of studies where you have to submit all of your raw data at the end. And I think we're going to have to do a lot of thinking and wrap our heads around how do we train the research community to collect and store their data in a way that makes it more feasible to upload it to these repositories. And then the other big question is, where are we going to put it? So I already use NIH money to pay for cloud services, and I'm sure some of you do too, to store all of that data. Where are we going to put it? I think is something we're still working on. And when do we deliver it? And so if it's something that's not going to go to publication, how do I deliver it? If it's sequencing data, that's pretty straightforward, but I do animal behavior stuff. I don't know where to put that. So I think we're going to have to ask a lot of questions. And in terms of putting on the ADR hat, I really see my role in the College of Sciences with Megan and Ginny and others that are here, of coming up with some guidance. So like, we're interfacing with NIH, we're asking all the same questions that you're asking, because I think where the rubber's really gonna hit the road is at just in time. I think we'll put in the grants, they'll get reviewed, they'll get an amazing score, and when the just in time comes in, that's when NIH is really gonna go after those plans. And we don't have a lot of time when the just in times come in. And I think it's gonna be bumpy. I think NIH is gonna learn, I think we're gonna learn. I think the first couple of years are gonna be like that authentication statement where no one had any idea what to put in it, and now we have a better sense. So I think there's gonna be a lot of dialogue in the upcoming year, and my goal is to try to provide people with as many resources as possible to make it as painless as possible and interface with the PDU and other groups to really be on the front end of that, because if it's all the way at the end, it's going to be a pain. And I think we're also going to use no-cost extensions to write. Right now we use no-cost extensions to kind of finish up, but we may have to take a second one just to do nothing but write. I don't know. So those are some of my perspectives.
Megan?
I'm Megan Curran. I am the College Research Office Director of Research Administration. So a lot of my feelings about this, Molly and Heather have also articulated already. So I'll focus on my concerns when it comes to post-award. So not only just in time, but once this is actually funded, what is going to be an allowable cost? What is going to be unallowable? What are we going to always consider indirect cost? What is going to always be an allowable direct cost? Because NIH has been very clear that we need to, like we do with other projects, handle these costs consistently across all of our colleges in a decentralized manner, and making sure we're just all on the same page. Along the same lines, that timeline for post-award, like the closeout process, as well as if people have a data curation year, what does that mean? How are we checking in with them? Also, beefing up our checklist for our PPR to make sure that we are checking for what NIH is expecting us to check for, or reaching back out to our PIs if we don't see that information in there. And I think one of the most interesting pieces of this that Missy and Chas brought to my attention is that, all the costs incurred for these projects have to be incurred during the performance period. So even if there's a 10-year data collection going on, you have to pay for that during the performance period per the NIH guidance right now. So you can think through that with an accounting hat on and kind of see how my head is spinning and how I'm going to Jenny and Heather, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I think it's going to require a lot of conversation, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of patience, I think, like Heather said, as we work through the road bumps and the hiccups along the way.
Thank you, Susan.
So hi, everyone. I'm Susan Ivey. I'm the director of the Research Facilitation Service, which is a collaborative effort between the university libraries, ORI and OIT. It's new this year. We just launched this spring. We're in a pilot phase with the College of Sciences. And so what we do is connect researchers to the computational services and data support and infrastructure that they need to conduct their research. And so we rely on a lot of service providers throughout campus. We also take note of needs that go unmet, or if there aren't resources or enough resources in place for those needs, and advocate for filling those gaps. And so when we think about this, I'm located within the libraries, and so half of our team is in libraries and half of our team is in research computing and OIT currently. And so when I think about this, I think about, I work within the libraries, think about what we provide in terms of data support already. So some of that is data management planning, data management plan reviews, thinking about an increase in that, a higher demand for that, and for us to understand really the importance of going along the way and updating those, and sort of what is our role, and how do we work with research office, the different offices throughout campus to support that, including ORI. I think about data storage costs, the infrastructure side that OIT provides, and wherever else everyone is getting their data storage. We think about a lot about data curation and reproducible data, and sort of what needs are going to increase around that for our research community and how we'll support those. And so I think there's a lot of unknowns. I don't have a whole lot more to add than what everybody said. A lot of the concerns are the same. I'm excited to be working with ORI and the colleges to sort of think about inventory, what we're already doing, and where we need to increase and expand our support. And then really thinking about how we can educate all of the different groups, including researchers, research offices, the libraries, Data Science Academy, everybody, and where OIT is going to need to expand as well and what to expect. So it's ongoing. NIH continues to put out information, and I think they'll continue after January, as everybody said. So.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll start with a couple of our pre-submitted questions, and then we'll open it up. What do you see as the biggest difference between the current resource sharing plan and the new data management and sharing policy?
So I touched a little on this in the slides, but essentially that it is now mandated for all projects that generate scientific data instead of just those over $500,000, and that it's a condition of award. So it's a binding document that we have to comply with throughout the life of the project.
I think another one is the monitoring. So right now you can submit your data management plan and there's really no monitoring. It's just kind of a trust system, and it seems like NIH is not going to do that anymore. That there is going to have to be someone monitoring it, and I think the big question is who. Is it just going to be the faculty member who attests in their progress report that they've done it, or is there going to have to be some sort of concrete check? And that's a question mark for me, is how that's going to be done and who is going to do it.
And I think that's the question mark for everybody, including NIH.
Yeah.
So it sounds like they expect the institution to also take on some of that, but what does that really look like? Right. So we'll have to see.
Good. And this kind of caters to something that Megan brought up earlier. What kinds of budget issues would you anticipate coming in the next semester as NC State tries to implement this policy?
Yeah.
Sorry, Megan.
That's $1 million question. I think I spoke to those kind of in the beginning a little bit, but really kind of what everyone's saying, what is an allowable cost that can be a direct cost on these projects? What is going to be infrastructure and kind of, supported by the university and always be an indirect cost? And can we incur or prepay costs when the service isn't going to end for another 10 years? And that's really like a state budgeting. I'm looking at Justo out there. I think I already sent him an email about that question, but I think that's one of the biggest questions that I have about the budgeting.
I was just going to say, oh, go
I
ahead.
would also just say effort too, like Molly said, like how are we defining effort, because we know NIH wants us to maintain minimum amounts of effort, and how are we proposing that throughout the life of the project? And ensuring that that effort is being taken throughout the life of the project as it was proposed, to make sure that the faculty have time to write their publications before the end of the project period.
So to build on that, with one of the questions that I would love to see examples from NIH for is right now they're saying that your data sharing costs should be an other line item, which is normally not where we would put personnel effort.
Nope.
So I think it's going to be a case where a lot of people are going to try a lot of different creative attempts of budget justifications. And I think eventually we'll settle into something that makes sense. But right now I'm a little bit worried about people putting in costs that may raise flags like at the institution, because it's not where we would normally put that cost, but they're trying to follow NIH's guidance. So I think we need to kind of take a look at how we're classifying costs and make sure that we're not doing something that gets us into trouble at the audit stage.
Well, just to add to that, NIH is starting to look different from other federal funders, which is confusing, right? So like if I put a computer on an NIH grant, I don't have any issues, but I've had faculty try to buy computers from other federal funders, and they say, no, you really should be doing that with FNA. Like your indirect should be covering those costs. And so we already have some of that inconsistency, and I'm just a little bit nervous that this policy is gonna make that inconsistency even more profound, and it's gonna be very confusing as to what is supposed to be coming from indirects and what is supposed to be coming from directs. And I'm hoping that NIH will give us a little grace as they implement this and we kind of work through it.
Yeah. All right, we have our first in-person question. We have a mic floating around. Thank you, Laura. That's okay.
I have to test. Okay. So my question kind of follows up on this other category. And, I wonder too, this is not going to be someone's full-time gig. And you probably don't want to trust a student with that. So is NIH going to create a core? Could I buy time for someone who could curate, there's a resource, because unless you have a big study, and I don't even think my study would support a person to manage that full time. If you have one R01, you're not going to need a full-time person to do that, and it's pretty unique expertise than running mice around a little maze. And so can we have a core? Can we have a core that I could put in as a line item in my budget, data management support core, 10K, 20, whatever? Is that a passive? It just seems like that's something we're gonna need.
It's a great question. Do our panelists have any responses or thoughts on that?
So I can give a little bit of a kind of what I've been hearing through the grapevine, basically watching some advisory councils meeting for the various institutes and centers. And we're seeing a fair amount of variety in terms of how different institutes are handling it, which worries me a little bit. But I would say some of the larger institutes and centers are thinking about putting out center-level types of projects that could potentially create a cooperative agreement network of consulting cores. So that's something that may come down the pipe as a new funding opportunity announcement. So kind of keeping an eye on that as an opportunity would be something to pay attention to. I've also seen some kinds of different ideas in terms of how existing cores may be leveraged for that kind of thing, but that creates kind of a haves and have-nots kind of situation. And some of the institutes already have sort of existing infrastructure. So if you're looking at the National Institute of Mental Health, they've got a huge NDAR is their repository that kind of built in some of that already. So they run it through kind of contract support. But I think what we're going to see is it's going to be fractured by discipline. So kind of keeping an eye on what's going on discipline by discipline.
My question was like at NC State, like I can send like genetic material to a lab and have a DSL and I pay for that. Are we gonna have like a data management core that we can pay them to help us through this maze?
So Jane, I think I'm going to speak to that, but I don't know. It's not an official. This is from me. But I think it's something that we think a lot about within the libraries and within the RFS as well. We talk a lot on campus about this, and sort of one of my, I think, like, I understand the idea and I think it's great. One thing that I wonder also about is scale and across the disciplines, what that would look like. I think we're very interested in thinking about what that could look like locally, but there are a lot of challenges to doing it in that way. And also sort of mapping, like Molly was saying, what already exists and then where are the gaps, and then like what are our expertise and skills and what can we fill? So, I think it's a wonderful idea, and I really think we're exploring all kinds of options right now. So that's what I would say from our side. And then, of course, talk to the administration too.
Well, just to add, I really think that's a good idea. And in terms of scale, right? So like NC State has like 45 million in NIH funds. Duke has 850, right? So our scale problem is much smaller than someone like Duke, right? But we're a very data-driven institution, and so I think there's an opportunity for us to shine if we developed a core like that. And then it also addresses the compliance issue, because if you have someone that's running the core and helping you upload the data, then you have someone that's involved in looking at it and focusing on these plans. So I think that's actually a very good idea. And I think there's a real struggle when people get all excited, they want to upload their data to a repository, Geo or whatever, and it's written in code that only, the people who wrote the code can understand. And so people give up. They don't put their data in the repository because it's a hurdle they can't get over. So having some expertise like that, even if you put a little effort on your grant or there's an hourly charge or whatever, is a potentially good solution.
And I just want to jump in and say, I also think that's a really good solution and something we could consider, because then you have a federally negotiated rate as a service center. Then we don't have to worry about direct and indirect. We're just, putting billable hours like we do for other cores and things like that as well. So.
Yeah, I'll just caution again, it's a great idea. It's just really, really hard to find. It takes so much time to curate and make your data reproducible that it's just, if that were easy, I think a lot of schools would already be doing it. So from a data curation background, it does take time. We do see things like the data curation network within data librarian fields where it's shared among institutions, and perhaps that's a model that could take off as well. So I think there are a lot of different things that we could consider.
And just to piggyback off of those, I also think that there's a path that, although not clear, there is a path that NIH is outlining where those costs, using curation services specific to your grant, could be an allowable cost. And I know that that's kind of the basics of what we're trying to figure out is going to be allowable or not. But I think that they anticipate that some of this curation happens outside of the institute. So I would say that that's more of the research that will have to go into prior, like pre-proposals into the submission, that when you are writing your scope of work, you're anticipating the type of data that will be produced, and then looking for resources that would fit that data to help curate and the repository of your choice. I think all of those are things you have to think about at pre-proposal stage. I would say even before you are into the application, because that will be really important to capture those costs in your budget.
Marissa, and to add to that, the repositories do have a role to play as well. So, for example, the libraries provides the Dryad data repository, which I hope you've heard about. It's an open access repository, And so NC State researchers can publish their data there for free because our membership covers the cost, and they do some basic curation. And so I think thinking about where repositories can fit in, and discipline repositories as well, and what kind of curation they can do, I think is, I'm hopeful that they'll start doing more of that.
I agree, and we did have the question of cost, you know, what's going to be an allowable cost, and Molly even mentioned, you know, from a state funds perspective, but I was looking at some of these terms of use for just different data repositories, and a lot of the ones that NIH recommends are free services for a good portion of what they offer. The ones that did discuss payment, discuss it being due in advance or at time of depositing the data, which would be an allowable cost for the life of the project. And that extends, you know, if the fee for depositing your data for 10 years is due within the project period, that's an allowable cost, even though it's you know, in that repository for a decade to come, that would still be allowable if it was due all within the project period, which is what I'm seeing in the few that I took a look at.
So as you can see, there's a lot of exploring and research being done behind the scenes and what other institutions are doing, what new guidance is coming out. So I think that was a great question, but it's also important to understand, like, we have to look at lots of different avenues and opportunities and challenges as part of it too. Thank you. Any other questions? We have another.
Hey, I have two questions. The first is that most of the research are done by the trainees, like a graduate student and postdocs. And I mean, you can talk to us, the PI, say you should do this data management, but actually the person who knows the data better are the trainees. So I wonder if there's any efforts in terms of providing training, a workshop, or maybe like some kind of resource, helping them to the kind of to the same level that they will probably actually curate and deposit data, right? Another, I guess the one thing I like the idea of sharing the data, but with this inflation and other things, the actual dollar goes to research, it's getting less and less. So, I mean, it's not your problem, it's like an NIH problem in a way, but I wonder how the university can mitigate some of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. From a research, education, and training standpoint, I typed in training for trainees to the level of PIs. So thank you for that. That's not something that we've previously discussed. So I think that's a really important point for us to consider as well.
Can I respond to that first question about training? You know, within the libraries, we do have a history of providing workshops and trainings, both on a request basis and then on what our areas of expertise are. And we were just on a call this morning with our colleagues at Duke University to understand what they're doing in terms of data training. So we're thinking about that within the libraries. And I know I work closely with Abby as well in thinking about what ORI might provide and to who. And so that is definitely something on our radar and how we might increase data training for graduate students, and faculty members as well.
I've also seen some of the data repository websites offer trainings in using their repositories, so that might be something to look into as well if it's repository specific.
Well, and NIH already requires responsible conduct and research training, so I think incorporating what you're suggesting, this data curation and repository use in that training might be one way to do that, might be one way to go about that. The costs it's a struggle, right? So NIH, I don't write modular budgets anymore, right? Because I mean, they haven't raised the amount in how long? Years and years and years. And we've already got massive inflation and other sort of budgetary pressures. You're right, it's gonna be costs that just keep driving up the size of those budgets. Hopefully NIH will address that reality and elevate the ceiling on the modular budget, but other than, you know, if they don't, we're looking at doing detailed budgets for probably every R01 that goes out the door.
Let's take a question from our virtual attendees as well. Do you think NIH has sufficient resources to approve plans in a timely fashion?
Do you want me to weigh in? Okay, so I should probably put a disclaimer here. So prior to coming to NC State, I was at NIH. And so what my vision is in terms of how this process is probably going to work is it's going to be very likely to parallel what happened with the public access policy in terms of having every program officer be required to kind of look at it and do that as part of their checklist before they're willing to sign off on any grant. So there is going to be somebody looking at every single grant. There will probably be somebody located at the Central Office of Policy, OPRA, who will have kind of a coordination role in kind of handling the FAQs. And the time it takes to kind of get those FAQs answered, I think is going to have a little bit of a learning curve there. So it could mean, as Heather brought up, your just-in-time phase may end up getting considerably longer, and the the messier your original plan is, the longer the just-in-time phase will likely be because it'll take more back and forths. And that's how I'm anticipating this will probably occur. So I don't know if that addresses the question, but.
Good job, Molly. Good job. All right, one more question. The new policy will start 2023. Will proposals submitted at the end of 2022 be affected?
No. No, they will not. I mean, from a compliance standpoint, no. If you are, as Heather said earlier, any proposals submitted prior to the January date are not don't fall under this policy. So.
And our college research office has just got a flood of proposals in for NIH to submit before the end of the year. Okay. We had an in-person question.
Yeah, been reading Department of Applied Ecology and CALS. I'd just like to make a comment here that if this is being implemented right now by NIH, it's a challenge for this kind of funding. But my guess is NSF is considering it, and this is probably moving forward going to be a requirement for funding from any federal source. So when we're looking at the strategies for this, especially when we're looking at what allowable costs here for direct versus F&A, and then for the strategy of this, I think it should be considered that this is going to be a federal agency problem, that we're going to have to do this for any projects coming into the university. And that really that, as we mentioned, the determining who pays these costs and how they should be broken out is really pretty critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond? Susan?
Well, I think for those who haven't seen, the OSTP released what's being called the Nelson Memo on August 25th. And so it is asking all federal agencies and departments to either update existing open policies or create them. I believe it's to the end of 2025, so beginning of 2026. And so what we're sort of expecting is that they will follow NIH's lead very much on implementation, but details of that will be coming out in the next couple of years. So I think you're exactly right.
And I just want to comment on that too, Ben. We've been discussing this in our team a little bit, and I was like, maybe we should have a justification just for the NIH, like a template. And my team said, no, we need to update the entire justification template because it's just a matter of time before all the federal agencies go towards that. And, you know, like Susan just said, that when they're streamlining all their administrative forms and things, this is something we have to look forward to.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess just to kind of weigh in on that a little bit, one thing I've noticed is NIH was a little bit behind the curve when it came to data management plans, because for the longest time it was just data sharing. Mm-hmm. And several other agencies had required data management plans that got into the weeds about what's the data type, what's the data format, what kind of metadata standards are you using. That kind of language was, I saw that much more frequently on, say, USDA proposals or DOE proposals where they were asking for that. So in some ways, NIH is catching up in terms of what they're asking for in the form. And I think it's mainly the issues of how it's being implemented where NIH is being a little bit more upfront.
All right. Are there any NC State-specific policies or regulations that our researchers need to keep in mind when developing data management and sharing plans?
So This is a great question. I will say that our policy for publication or for sharing of data refers back to the sponsors policy, which in this case is a little bit circular because NIH basically says that that researchers need to make the data available for as long as it is scientifically relevant or applicable. So I think that our policies do not contradict what NIH, what their intentions are. I don't think they're necessary. I don't think it helps define what that looks like either. I feel like in this situation, it really is pushing the researcher to use their knowledge and discretion to decide what that looks like. And I'll kick it over to Mary. I see you.
A microphone for Mary. We are lucky enough to have Mary Millsaps, Director of Regulatory Compliance, in the audience, the in-person audience.
Thank you. I've been doing a really good job of keeping my mouth shut. You guys have done a great job on this topic. To answer the question, though, I think it's important to point out that research data is a record related to a federal award. So there is a baseline requirement to keep that data for 3 years after the final submitted financial report. So that's the baseline. This is also state of North Carolina public records. So we have to maintain that data until the schedule that's published in the records repository policy, and I don't have the reference, but I think you guys do. And that is the point, that is the schedule that points back to the federal regulation. So they need to keep in mind that 3-year baseline, but they also should consider where that data goes. So data repositories, journals will have requirements. So again, that's really just like talking to the IRB about your data management plan. If you have human subject data, you should be thinking about ultimately where the data is going to go and where those retention requirements will be driven by. 3 years minimum, but your repository may have, so those are the things that they need to think about. But absolutely, NIH encourages you, and as the RIO, I encourage you to keep your data available for as long as it's relevant. So, after a publication.
The paper is published, to go in and attach like a Dryad link or whatever, if you want to put all your raw data in there. And so I would imagine that a lot of journals are going to start to do that, especially since publishing is really moving online. Like, you don't get the magazine on your desk anymore. Having an opportunity to interface with the faculty member, and so when the paper comes out, there's an opportunity for you to add additional information, which might be a way to put in the negative data or data that you didn't include, or your raw data or whatever. So I think the journals are also going to be responding to this as well.
So I'm not sure how many folks are aware of this, but PubMed Central is also going so that you can upload data sets tied to your PubMed Central records, which I think is really going to be helpful because my sense is that I'm guessing the program officers, when they're trying to look for compliance, they're going to start with your publication list and then see if they can find the data sets that go with your publication list. So if it's tied to your PubMed Central record, that may make things easier at the RPPR stage. But that is limited in the data size. So this is one of those things for small data sets, that's fine. Big data sets, not so much.
Yeah, that's the problem with almost every repository. But it's a community problem, so it's not just our problem.
Okay. So is it up to the PI to determine if research is subject to this new data management and sharing policy? And then I'm going to piggyback off of that as well and talk and ask a little bit about defining responsibilities here at NC State between a PI as well as college research offices, and then also responsibilities within the Sparks office. It's a lot, sorry.
Yeah, so I would say, yes, I think the responsibility ultimately falls on the researcher because they know their research and the output better than I think any of the rest of us. However,
I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that the guidance that NIH has put out is reflected out to the community, and that there are resources that can be accessed throughout the life of the project to make sure that we're in compliance and that we are defining what research data is by NIH standards. So I would say ultimately, yes, the researcher is responsible, but it takes a village, so.
And I just want to add to that and say, I think, with having faculty have to now sign their other support documents as well, that there's this push to make them realize that they are responsible, but I want to provide tools as the research office that make it easy for our faculty to comply with this. I don't want it to be something that they're already, working on so many pieces when they're putting through proposals. So I want to have tools in hand that make this, supportive for them, and support them as they're working on it, and then also impose towards so that we can provide them tools so they're not just out there, feeling their way through this themselves.
Yeah, I agree, and I have to give a lot of props to the Research Facilitation Service and the library for being on top of it and ahead of it, yes, because I've had a lot of conversations with them to try to navigate this water, and I think that the responsibility is shared among all of our different groups to make it as easy as possible for the PI to do what they're supposed to do, because it's really hard to comply when you don't understand what the rules are, like, I don't know. So I think the dialogue that's already happening at NC State is very good. I think a lot is gonna happen in that first year. We're just gonna stumble our way through it and update our policies, and I think we just have to be very proactive about communicating what we do and do not know as this thing gets implemented. So, yeah.
Dr. Pascal, you actually bring a different perspective to the panel as both the ADR and a researcher. So I did want to ask, what guidance or advice would you give to other researchers that are just diving into this, learning about the new policy, and trying to prepare for proposal submissions next year?
Well, I would start with NIH's materials and their website, and then I would go to the Research Facilitation Service. That's exactly what I did.
I thought you were gonna say start with us. I loved your answer.
Like, I have a bunch of questions. Yeah, so that's an incredible resource. The library is an incredible resource. NIH's facts are still kind of confusing and they're incomplete. But that's the two places that I would start. And then my goal, and Megan shares this goal, is to make the research office in the college also a source for information as things evolve. So trying to build tools for faculty so that they have everything they need right in front of them as they're starting to pull this together. I have grants over 500K, so I've used the old policy, and I think if no one's ever done anything like that before, it's consulting people who've already done it, consulting people who've done it for USDA. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So again, I think it comes back to communication and being as transparent as possible.
That's great. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to open the floor to our panelists. If there's anything that we didn't ask that you'd like to add, any last comments or thoughts?
So I did want to stress one of the things that I'm hearing repeatedly from NIH is that the stress is that all data must be managed, but not all data must be shared. And there are some situations where you don't need to share the data. And so, for example, if you're doing secondary analysis and somebody else owns the data, there is a way for you on your plan to say, this is not my data to share. But if you're going to do that, you need to provide additional information that will still allow you to be able to demonstrate that your data is replicable or that your experiments are replicable. So, for example, if you're looking at electronic health records data and you're doing sort of a machine learning type of approach, what you would need to do is include some of the metadata for what fields you're pulling down, what date you pulled it down, just in case there are updates in terms of your data source, to kind of explain how you're getting that data, but you aren't going to be held responsible for sharing it again, because they don't want multiple copies of the same large data set that may be slightly different from each other going out into the world. So I think understanding if you're using somebody else's data or if you have some sort of privacy issues with your data, thinking about the language that you want to use to specify why you're not sharing, but that you're still managing is going to be really important. And thinking about what kinds of standards are used in your field can be really helpful. So that's one of the things we'll help navigate, I guess.
And just to add to that, under their rigor and reproducibility policy, we're also gonna have to share and manage code. So if you wrote a whole script in R to analyze the data, that script is gonna have to be managed and shared as well.
I just want to say, as we're thinking through this, to encourage people who are going to be submitting to start their timelines earlier, to reach out to their research offices as early as possible, to reach out to the IRB if you have human subjects, to reach out to the libraries as soon as possible, because I think what Molly said at the beginning is all of our timelines have to move back so that we have enough time to really successfully get these proposals together and submit it on time.
Especially during this first year, I would say, of
Yes.
implementation, because we're all going to be searching for the answers together.
Okay. If you have additional questions or we weren't able to get to yours, the Menti will be open for an additional 24 hours. Please feel free to submit your questions, your thoughts. I'll collect them and share them with our working group and talk through them. You may see additional communication. You will definitely see additional resources and educational opportunities that come up. So thank you for attending, both in person as well as our virtual attendees. Of course, thank you, big thank you to our panelists for serving. So we hope you found today's session informative and helpful. Be sure, like I said, to watch for more resources coming in the coming months on this topic as well as others. Visit our research, education, and training website. We have a new website launching this month. We're very excited. There will be a researcher resources page dedicated just for our resources for our researchers. So definitely check that out. And it also links to some of our partners here on campus, including university libraries, the PDU, and other resources that you have available. You will receive an evaluation. Please complete it. Give us your thoughts and feedback. We want to make sure that any training opportunities or resources we develop meet your needs. So thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.